So some of you are new to me here today, and two of you I saw this morning. For anybody who hasn't met me before, my name is Neve, and my background is I'm a chartered psychologist. So as a psychologist, I worked in counselling for 20 years, and then I had a private practice in South Dublin, and closed up shop in July 19, somehow preempting COVID, retrained in coaching, and just came out of that. And of course, the world shut down. So pretty much, started a new business in COVID. And so I've been, for the last few years, coaching primarily senior leaders, and I'm still available for one-to-one work. Um, I've always done work with corporates. I've always done, particularly in the well-being arena, lots of talks, webinars, and trainings as well. Um, and then I was running group programs for women, female leaders over the past few years, but I've closed those down now because I have been working with Dr. Lola Gershfeld from the States and training in her emotional connection process, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about today and give you some tools from it as well. So that's kind of my background. And today, it's a masterclass, so we'll do a little exercise that you can just do yourself. So to give you the kind of practical experience of using one of the tools. Um, and to help you so you can deepen your own understanding of emotions in the workplace. And so we'll start with just like a quick look at the science, I suppose, in the background and the brain's relationship with emotions. And picking out maybe the what I think is probably the most relevant part of the neuroscience out there on emotions. So the amygdala is that small little kind of almond-shaped piece of the brain, which it's a very old part of the brain, and that's the center of emotions. So when we have a strong emotional response, that the amygdala has been triggered. The interesting thing for me about the amygdala is that it has the ability to override other parts of the brain, including our prefrontal cortex. Okay. So the prefrontal cortex, that part of the front, is our logic center. It's where our executive functioning takes place. It's our impulse control. So our teenagers do not have a fully grown prefrontal cortex. It's not fully grown and developed until we're about 24, which is why teenagers can be impulsive and maybe hard to control sometimes. They literally don't have that brain function. Here's the thing, though, even though we like to think of ourselves as logical, as sorry, no, actually, yeah, I am recording. I'm just making sure I restarted recording. I can quite easily forget. Um, Even though we like to think of ourselves as logical, rational, people with, thinking our own thoughts, and controlling what we think, really the prefrontal cortex does not have the power to override the amygdala, and yet the amygdala has the power to override the prefrontal cortex. So it's a one-way street. So if the amygdala is in the driving seat, the prefrontal cortex doesn't get to steer at all. And that's very relevant because that means that our emotions can influence us. Then, if we're in amygdala hijack, our emotions can overrule any sense that we might have. And, we can end up saying or doing things that we regret later. And that can impact, of course, our relationships, and frequently does, and creates disconnections with people that matter to us. And that's if we're not good at kind of self-calming and self-regulating our emotions, that can create havoc in the workplace as well. Okay, because there's no point in trying to reason with somebody who's in a highly emotional state or emotionally aroused state, because their prefrontal cortex doesn't have a look in. It's in the back seat. So we have to find a way of calming a person down first before we can get any sense through with them or to them or from them. So I think that's probably the most relevant part, there for you to understand. Certainly, that's the bit that impacted on me. And you can see a little diagram there with the amygdala on the bottom with, it's got pathways to all the different parts of the brain that can override whatever it wants to, and yet it doesn't necessarily happen the other way around. We don't have pathways back that way. Okay. So looking at psychology, when I suppose the most relevant piece here is attachment theory. So I wanted just to help you to understand, the basics of attachment theory. It's gained a lot of favor in the past maybe 10 years or so. You actually see a lot of it on Instagram, different coaches using, attachment theory in relationships, and who's securely attached and who's insecurely attached and what to do if you are. So we're not going to go into it in great detail, but just to understand that this was developed in the 50s, really, and 60s by John Bowlby initially, and Maria Ainsworth would have done quite a bit of research with Bowlby, and Bowlby would be the best known. And really, attachment theory is about that kind of emotional bond that is formed between two people. So they studied babies, newborns, and infants, and they found that, our first attachment figure is our primary caregiver, very often the mother. And when a baby is born, that baby is totally dependent on their caregivers, particularly the primary caregiver, to be fed, to be picked up, to be held for all their most basic needs. They're so dependent. And so that attachment can help that baby to survive. And what Bowlby found is that the earliest bonds that are created, that first attachment bonds that we create with the primary caregiver, often the mum, is like a template then for our future relationships. So that can be good news and that could be bad news. If we're securely attached, if a baby is picked up when they cry and their nappy is changed when they're wet and they're fed when they're hungry, then they learn that the world is a safe place and that, I can be looked after and I can trust other people to mind me and I'm safe in the world. Whereas if a baby's primary needs are not being met or they're, unpredictable, so sometimes they might be getting attention, other times they might be left to cry on their own for hours, not being fed when they need and so on. Now, that can happen for a variety of means, usually because the primary caregivers are not available, maybe emotionally or maybe not even physically. So if, for example, there's drug or alcohol addiction, that might get in the way, mental illness might get in the way. It could be as simple as, a mum struggling with postnatal depression and really not having anything to give because of their own struggle. So they can't meet their child's needs because their needs are not being met at that time themselves. But those kind of experiences that early can create that template that I don't know if I can trust the world, or my needs are not met, or it's unpredictable. And so the child may end up with a different kind of insecure attachment. And again, that can serve as a template for how people deal in relationships throughout. Sometimes, for example, rejecting others so that I can't be rejected. I'll reject first. That can often be, one trait. What's probably really relevant here is that what Bowlby and others have demonstrated in attachment theory is that nurturance and responsiveness are key determinants of attachment. And nurturance and responsiveness, they're really important because that also comes into how we are in the workplace. Okay, that determines our attachment. So if we bring this now into the workplace, and how does this apply to work relationships? It's not like a parent and a child, or is it? Well, we are social creatures. We cannot thrive in isolation. We're not born to be hermits. We live in a planet with 8 billion people and growing. So it's hard to find us the top of a mountain anymore to go off to. And actually our greatest challenges often come in relationships, but also our biggest resource is emotional connection with other human beings, particularly those we depend on. And here's the thing, we depend on people at work. We depend on our boss. If you're a leader, you depend on your direct reports and your team. We depend on our colleagues, okay? So there is a dependence there, and we need that emotional bond to feel safe and secure. So when we work together, we actually impact on each other physiologically, even if that's happening across Zoom. If you're meeting somebody with whom you don't really trust or you're a little bit afraid of, for example, your heart rate is going to be impacted, your breathing will be impacted, you might be sweating. Your emotions are also impacted when you work together physiologically, and that can be positive or negative. It could be that, you feel great after working with one person and you're, sick with anxiety after work with somebody else. So we are impacting each other whether we realize it or not. And when we can't find a safe way of connecting with somebody that we have some dependence on or we need to work with, we end up moving into negative cycles. And that takes us further away from where we want to be. So we want to feel connected, we want to feel safe, we want to feel like we can trust this person. But if we feel that disconnect and we don't feel safe, then we're starting to activate the amygdala, starting to come from that place. And then, our good sense often goes out the window, or we may not be able to behave or focus. We might just not be able to focus or concentrate on the work. We're not going to be coming up with the ideas or the solutions in the same way. So we're actually, in order to be effective in our work, in order to perform and be productive, we need to connect and feel safe. And yourselves, there's been a huge amount of work done on psychological safety, but emotional safety contributes to that psychological safety. So emotional connection, you'll hear me refer to emotional connection, or EMC, brings together neuroscience and attachment theory into alignment, really teaching us the language of emotions and helping us to articulate emotional responsiveness. Again, going back to Bowlby, the nurturing and the responsiveness, so that we have the skills to stay emotionally connected even when there's disagreement or there's difficulty or where there's conflict, where we might be able to reconnect after a disconnect. So really, by tuning into each other's emotions and respecting the emotional state that the other person is in, and if we're able to create that safe environment for people to express their emotions, which really is not happening in the workplace so far, we can interrupt the brain's immediate panic responses and instead help to move into positive interactions. Through time and with practice, and with enough people practicing this, you can turn a toxic environment into a safe environment. It happens very quickly, really, that, someplace can begin to turn toxic, in the sense that if there's a disconnection, if that isn't dealt with, or isn't, you don't get to the source of the issue, then very often what happens is those two people are maybe, putting on the professional veneer and yes, okay, yeah, no, that put on the professional veneer, getting on with each other on a very surface level, but I don't trust you and I don't like you. And, and I might well bitch to my colleagues over here about you because, I'm not feeling good about that relationship. And it doesn't take long for those colleagues then to be suspicious of this person or treating them differently. And very quickly, either that person is, being blamed for everything that goes wrong, or there's a whole toxicity being set up, which is dangerous, as we know. And then people start to disengage very quickly. So just first of all, to maybe clarify the difference between conflict and what I'm calling a disconnect here, a disconnection. Conflict we're aware of, I suppose at its extreme, it's fisticuffs. It's rarely going to be that, and the hope in the office. But conflict generally is not well dealt with in workplaces. We do have, plenty of conflict resolution approaches, and there's mediation. But usually things have got to a very bad place before they're even engaged. So this is about bringing the skills in at a much earlier level, so that when we experience a disconnect, that we don't go into conflict, that you can resolve a disconnect. So think of a relationship, any relationship. It could be a relationship at home. If you have a partner, you will have experienced disconnection with your partner. They say something, they have a particular tone, or they do something that, and there can be a disconnect. And it takes a little bit to heal that and feel warm and loving towards them again. but you know also what it feels like when that disconnect is there. Now, if that's not healed, if that's, when you're living with somebody, you've invested a lot in that relationship. So you want, it's too difficult to keep in that disconnected place in that negative cycle. Some relationships do, and it can be kind of ruinous if it's stuck in a negative cycle for a long time. But most of us will work hard at trying to get it back into the positive place. But in the workplace, often that doesn't happen. It's not dealt with well. Maybe you feel the disconnect with somebody who you report to, your boss, your manager, and it may be too threatening. I feel too unsafe to even bring that up. We don't necessarily have the skills or the permission. So this is about changing that, really. So let's take a deeper dive into emotions and to understanding them. And remember, like haven't been a therapist for 20 years and a coach for about 5. I've worked with one-to-one hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and also delivered to group trainings, I suppose, to thousands, and yet learning this approach over the past year has given me a new set of tools, one of which I'm going to share with you today, which I think have been really helpful in understanding emotions and what happens when there's a disconnection or there's conflict. So first of all, if you have a secure attachment in the workplace, then your brain is going to be less reactive. Basically, you're safe. So your amygdala is nice and calm. Your prefrontal cortex is able to operate, and you're able to focus and to concentrate and do the work. Okay, your energy just goes to doing the work. But if you feel insecure in your relationship, if you feel that there's a disconnect, if there's a lack of trust or there's a breakdown in that trust, our brain can press the panic button and it kind of goes into survival mode. So that's fight or flight. And recent research over, recent years in neuroscience has shown us that, like, initially, that amygdala would have been, that fight or flight response was designed really to help us to survive if we were attacked by a bear or tiger in the woods. Okay. So if we went out of the cave many eons ago to, go and hunt and gather for our lunch, if there was a bear or a tiger, we had to go into fight or flight response to help us to survive. We either had to play dead, freeze, and hope that they pass us by, or we fight and, hope that we can scare them off and get them running away, or climb a tree or whatever it might be to survive. So people who were on high alert and wary, they passed on their genes. The people who weren't got eaten. Okay, they didn't get to pass on their genes. So that is still in us. And what scientists have found is that nowadays, of course, we're not facing bears and tigers, but nowadays the same reaction in our brain is elicited when we experience social exclusion or isolation. So even the threat of that is enough to trigger that kind of inner reaction in us. It's a panic, really, because we're social animals, because we really belong in the tribe. The threat of exclusion, certainly in our tribal days, if you were kept out of the tribe, if you were excluded from the tribe, you weren't going to survive for long. So it still sends the same danger signals to us as if we were living in caves and needed the tribe to survive. We still do in a different way. So emotions are fast. They travel very quickly, and so it can be very difficult for us to differentiate even between our emotions, because we get a whole rush of emotions at once, and we can feel maybe overwhelmed by a rush of emotions and not be able to even tell what emotion we're feeling. But the other thing about emotions being fast is that we quite unconsciously pick up emotions from another person's face in about 100 milliseconds. Very quickly, we're reading something on their face. So if we go into an office and there's a look, we have interpreted that and we're already reacting to that before we consciously know what's happening, and maybe we were reacting and that comes out. So as soon as we open our mouths, we're coming out with a reactive tone, which then sets the next person them off, and they're now reacting to us, and it can escalate very quickly. And all it was a look which might have had nothing to do with you in the first place. They might have just got off a bad call, or they might have been stressed or whatever, but it's all these misinterpretations and unconscious stuff that tends to go on because it's all happening so quickly. So we have to learn how to slow things down, to recognize and bring awareness to what's happening. And we can't do that when it's really fast. We have to find ways to slow it down. We have to become present and bring our awareness to it. Emotions can be powerful agents of change, and that can be a positive or a negative. But like as a coach, emotions are very powerful and help people to transform and transition through and create change. Without that emotion, without them going in and feeling that emotion and connecting with it, it's harder because you don't just change things by thinking about it. Otherwise, we'd all be able to think ourselves into great situations. We have to really feel our way in as well. So the first EMC resource that I want to tell you about today is the slow motion camera. It's really that powerful ability that we all have with practice, though, to slow things down. So slow down the conversation, help people to focus in on their emotions, helping yourself first of all. We start with number one, and even being able to replay key moments to create a deeper understanding. When there's a disconnect, it can escalate very quickly. And I don't know if you've ever had a shouting match with your partner, but you sometimes wonder, how did this happen? How did we get into this? It started way over there, and now we're way over here in very dangerous territory. And the same, we're a little bit more maybe controlled in the office often. And what tends to happen is we withdraw maybe earlier so that we don't go into that direct conflict. We shut down. But the problem is still there. We might be being nicer, but the problem is still there, and there's a lack of trust and there's a breakdown. So the slow motion camera is really about kind of slowing it right down, coming into the present, breathing, being aware, using whatever skills you can to slow things down and become aware of your emotions and tuning in with what might be happening for the other person. So you can get good at actually regulating other people's difficult emotions, believe it or not. And as a leader, that's something that we have to be able to do to some extent, as well as our own, of course, own first. So this understanding, this tool really about emotions is something that I'm going to go into now. This is, I think, really helpful. And so the worksheets I'm going to use with you here and show you here are available. If you have signed up, if you've subscribed to my newsletter on my website, you will have already received this if you signed up recently. Or if you didn't sign up recently, but you've been signed up for a long time, you'll have received it as part of the newsletter this week that went out. If you literally only... Yeah, I think you should probably all have received this anyway, so you'll understand it better after today and you have the tool. So surface emotions are the ones literally on the surface. They're the emotions that are visible to us. They're easy to identify. They're the ones that we see happening in front of us, particularly where there's a disconnect. So that's the anger, the frustration, the irritation. We can read it off the other person. And that's what we're feeling usually on the surface as well. There may be shutdown, there may be others. We'll go through them now in a moment. But they're the easier to identify ones. So when there's a rush of emotions happening, the surface emotions are the ones that we will usually be able to name. And the better that you can get at naming your emotions, then, sorry, itchy eye, then the more articulate you get, the better that is actually even diffusing your emotions. So when we can name quite succinctly our emotions, that helps us to regulate them. But the surface level is usually where we're aware. I'm aware I'm really feckin' annoyed right now. I just picked up my daughter and she ranted for a good 10 minutes about the teacher of the last class that she had, So we know when we're angry and there's a lot of energy to anger and it can help us to feel powerful. So some people can get quite attached to that anger and stay in it. However, that's what's happening on the surface. And when we are only dealing on the surface, that's what's meeting. The two are meeting the surface emotions, and that's what's happening in the office usually because you're seeing the surface emotions, reacting to them, and either you're a pursuer in the negative cycle who's like, we need to talk, we have to sort this out. And interestingly, 70% of those really proactive people who want to sort it out and kind of head into conflict, 70% of them are women. I've only learned this today. The other style is the withdrawer, and the person who withdraws is really trying to save the relationship by getting out of there. So they're like avoiding that conflict. We can't go there. It's going to explode. It's dangerous. So 70% of those are men, apparently. But in different relationships, you may be the pursuer, other times you may be the withdrawer. I would find that it's a bit like Pac-Man. So the pursuer, if you think of it, is chasing after, and the pursuer behaviors can come across on the surface as critical or judgmental or demanding. We need to talk. This is a problem. You have to, blah, 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 and drilling down. And so, quite naturally, maybe the other person is running away from that and withdrawing. And both people, this is really important. This is part of the negative cycle that we all get caught up in when there's a disconnect. Both positions can be understood to be attempts at saving the relationship, believe it or not. The pursuer believes that this needs to be faced on, needs to be talked to, we need to deal with this. The withdrawer believes it's dangerous, we need to get out of there, this is going to explode, this is not good for the relationship, I have to get out of here. And sometimes the pursuer might be running after the withdrawer and then at a point kind of give up and both people withdraw, then the relationship's not happening, because both people are just avoiding each other. Or if both people are pursuing, then there tends to be an explosion, a bit of a blow up. And sometimes the withdrawer senses that the pursuer has stopped, and then they may turn around and Pac-Man starts happening the other way then. Again, in an attempt to re-engage this relationship, because if we both withdraw, is there any relationship? Okay. So that tends to be the cycle. So you might identify for yourself whether you tend to be a pursuer or you tend to be the person who withdraws. Here's the thing. Under those surface emotions, there are softer emotions. We're often not as aware of them. They tend to be our vulnerable emotions. So we often don't like being aware of them. We don't like touching in there because it's soft and it's mushy and we feel vulnerable and unsafe. So it can be harder for us to get in touch with those, but they're there under the surface. What's interesting is when we stay in our surface emotions, we push people away. When we go into the vulnerable emotions, we actually often pull people closer. And we know Brené Brown is a leader in this research, the power of vulnerability in the workplace. And yet, there has to be some safety in order for us to be vulnerable. If you think of a crab, or lobsters, for example, lobsters, they outgrow their shell and they have to I don't know how often they have to cast off that shell. And they're very vulnerable at that time. They could be eaten. So they hide behind a rock. But then they grow a new shell, an exoskeleton. It takes time. So when we're vulnerable, it's like we don't have our shell. And we can be hurt. And yet that vulnerability means also that it's easier for us to connect with somebody else. It's softer. We're more approachable. We're more human. We're maybe more likable even at that point. And that can pull people together. So if you share from a vulnerable place, it's hard not to listen. It de-escalates the situation. So when we stay in our surface emotions, it can escalate, it can push people away. And that's contrary to what we want to do, because it's kind of a push and pull where we want to connect, but we're giving out and we're pushing them away, with our, maybe even if not verbally, maybe with our body language, for example. Okay. So here's the surface emotions, and you'll notice that these are the negative surface emotions because in this context, we're talking about disconnection, we're talking about, where conflict is happening. Frustration, annoyed, irritated, shut down, feeling resentful, maybe frozen or numb, might be very upset, disturbed, tense, disappointed, betrayed, angry, might be confused, alone, or feel exhausted. Okay, so they're the surface emotions. They're the ones we're often aware that we're feeling or can maybe read in somebody else's behavior. The softer emotions, then, the more vulnerable ones that are a layer underneath the surface, are where you're feeling worried, you might be feeling shaky, feeling isolated, a very vulnerable one, feeling unimportant or dismissed. Like, think of these feelings in relation to your partner at home, or in relation to an important colleague or your boss, whoever you report to. These are very vulnerable. We don't like to feel this in relationship. Let down, helpless, hopeless, hurt, panicked, intimidated, overwhelmed, inadequate, feel rejected, feel abandoned, feel like we're failing, feel embarrassed, defeated, not heard, not valued, and desperate. Okay? Difficult feelings to feel. We often will do whatever we can to avoid them. And yet it's really important if we can recognize that these are the feelings that we're feeling. Which of these? So you have your surface layer, you have your softer layer, and really down at the core, then you have your primary emotions. What do all these boil down to? What's at the root of these other feelings, feeding into them? And the four key primary emotions that we work with are fear, sadness, shame, and surprise. There are two more, anger and joy. Um, Anger, though, is very often a surface emotion rather than a primary emotion. So that we treat it as a surface emotion here for these purposes, because usually anger has other stuff going on in layers underneath. And I would have always found that as a therapist, that somebody might come in very angry with their partner, for example, from what has happened, but the layers underneath it, the vulnerable, softer emotions, are that they've been really hurt, or maybe they felt dismissed. Maybe they're, and at the core, they're afraid. They're afraid of losing the relationship, or they're really sad that they cannot connect with the person that they love. Um, so yeah, so we treat anger as a surface emotion and look for what's hiding underneath. So primary emotions really get to the heart of the matter, and they're part of our survival instinct. And all of these emotions are universal across cultures and evoke similar responses. Okay. So, going to get you to do a little reflective exercise. I'd like you to think of a recent disconnection. It may have been just a little disconnect in a personal relationship, or, at a work relationship, maybe somebody that you need to get on with and don't, or maybe a difficulty with a boss or a direct report, depending on your situation, or so any which way, up, down, sideways. Um, just pick one, bring to mind, maybe one of your most recent kind of disconnection experiences, where you felt emotions about it. And go back, first of all, and maybe jot down some of the surface emotions that you felt. Now, sometimes you might feel about 10 of those. There can be, when you're when that amygdala is really activated, you could be frustrated, annoyed, irritated, resentful, upset, disturbed, tense, definitely, betrayed, angry, and maybe confused. Why the hell is this happening? What do they say that for? Or whatever it might be. So once you've recognized your surface emotions, I'd like you then to look at the softer emotions. And again, jot down for yourself, which of these did you feel in that situation? more vulnerable emotions. Okay. And then finally, I'd like you to identify your primary emotion. Which of these was at the root for you? Was it fear? Was it sadness? Was it shame? Or was it surprise? Very often in the workplace, it's fear or sadness. Shame is a very difficult emotion. It's right down, we've got a very low vibration. If we feel it like in the pit of our stomach, we could go our whole lives avoiding touching into the shame. You know, if you think of people with trauma, often could go a lifetime without bringing that out into the open because of the deep-seated sense of shame that they're carrying. It's very difficult emotion. So we all have different ways of avoiding feeling these negative emotions, the ones that we don't like. Um, you might find yourself in the fridge going, what am I doing here? I'm not even hungry. Oh, I know. It could be simple as boredom, but often there is some kind of stressful emotion going on for us. Uh, Maybe you're a workaholic because when you sit still, the emotions come up. Sometimes people are over exercising, again, to kind of work out the surface emotions without really processing them or dealing with them. So we all have different ways of avoiding some of those negative emotions. Drink, drugs, food, lots of different ways. Um, okay, so hopefully you've been able to identify the layers in that you experienced in that disconnection. So maybe a little bit of homework for you would be to go back and look at what do you think the other person was experiencing? The surface emotions you can probably recognize because you probably saw them coming at you. Um, can you identify what might have been going on for them in the softer emotions layer? And then what do you think was the primary emotion there for them? So that can help you to gain a little bit perspective and already begin to change how you feel towards them. Even just that small little exercise. Great help sheet to use with kids at home as well if you're trying to be their emotional coach. And that's something that as you're getting more familiar with using it yourself, maybe you could begin to work with it in the office, in work. So let's look a little bit more at feelings. We know that feelings are actually more unpleasant if we fight them, and boy, do we fight them. But resistance is futile. You might have heard the phrase, what you resist persists. So it's again, it's kind of like a principle of science. If the equal but opposite force, like when you come up against something, you get that force coming up against you in the same way, it'll match it. Um, and so even though we don't like to feel these and we push them away, actually that doesn't get rid of them. And often it's like just growing a lump under the carpet. It causes other problems and goes off in other directions. So if we can learn to sit with them and accept them, that they're there, very often emotions come like waves. And part of my job as a coach often is if somebody's experiencing a really difficult emotion is to sit with them through that. So I become almost the life raft that's accompanying you in that deep water so that you can see and experience the wave. It does come up, but it gets scary as it's going up, and then it breaks and comes down the other side. When you can experience that, then it feels safer to feel those difficult emotions, that you can feel them and survive and it'd be okay. You can learn to ride the waves. So lots of different feelings arise from those four basic primary emotions. So for example, suspicion comes from fear, loneliness comes from sadness. So there's, those four basic ones may be at the root, but there might be lots of other feelings coming from those. And we feel and function better when we're aware of our feelings, when we can name and identify our feelings, and when, can deal with them and be with them, even if they're painful. Um, and that's a journey I think everybody has to go through. I'm not sure I've met anybody who's really good at just being with the negative emotions because we just don't like them. We don't like to feel shit, and we'll try and avoid them. And yet, very often, yes, there are times when it's not useful, to feel them, but most of the time we need to sit and process them and to get out the other side. So feelings do happen in the workplace too, and they happen in relationships. So bringing awareness to them means that they're less likely to leak out in the wrong direction, because often what we do is we put the lid on and they just come out sideways instead, coming out often at the wrong person in the wrong direction, or at a time when we didn't mean it and we're just extra tired that day. So it all explodes, and we've been keeping a lid on it up to that point. And somebody gets it. That just they pressed the wrong button on the wrong day. So I think emotions are nearly like the last frontier. We've known a lot about them for a long time, and yet certainly in the workplace they've been ignored. They haven't been dealt with there, and where there's disconnection or conflict, it still is generally very poorly dealt with in the workplace. People don't have the skills. And of course, we talk about emotional intelligence. I'm trained in the EQI measurement of emotional intelligence. There are 15 different measures of emotional intelligence. You can break it down in a lot of different components. And still people, even though emotional intelligence has been around, Daniel Goleman wrote that book first in 1995, and Barron started working in this in the 70s. So it's around as a concept a long time. And still, if you were to say, if you're to ask me, well, how do I grow? How do I become more emotionally intelligent? It's been very difficult to kind of go, well, this is the route, this is the roadmap. So I think EMC gives us a very good roadmap for that, for building the skills to be present with people. Another tool that's used is AORE, which is really about answering that question: are you there for me? We need to know that, for example, our manager or a colleague is there for us, and certainly our partner. Are you there for me? And AORE stands for accessible, responsive, and engaged. So if you can practice being accessible, responsive, and engaged, even and particularly when there are difficult emotions around, you're onto a winner. And if you listen to those accessible, responsive, and engaged, they're very closely linked with Bowlby's attachment necessities there, the nurturance and responsiveness. So what is this EMC that I've been mentioning? EMC stands for emotional connection, and the EMC strategy is really centered around the systematic exploration of emotions which are present in times of great stress, uncertainty, and volatility. And let's face it, folks, the last few years have been constant stress, uncertainty, and volatility in the workplace, the VUCA world that we live in. And you think, oh, just as soon as we get out of COVID now then there's hybrid working, and oh, we're just coming out of hybrid work and pushed back to work. And then, oh, there's another war. And it's like one thing after another, and it's extremely uncertain and volatile. So there are a lot of difficult emotions around. But when they're understood and addressed, really people can work to create emotional safety in the workplace so that relationships can be restored. So one of the key differences between EMC and other maybe conflict resolution or mediation approaches is that EMC does not focus on the content of the argument or the disagreement. I don't need to hear the whole story of what he said, she said, and why you disagree and why you're right or he's wrong or whatever it might be, because it's all about the relationship. It's all about, well, okay, so recognizing the different steps in the negative cycle that I've been mentioning to you. What triggered you first of all, and when you were triggered, what happened? What were the raw spots for you? And when that happened, what were your surface emotions? What were your softer emotions? What was your primary emotions? And then when that happened, what were your protective behaviors? What did you automatically go into doing? Recognizing them for you, recognizing them for the other person, hearing and learning, and then moving into a positive cycle together. So this has all been developed and researched over the past 15 years by Dr. Lola Gershfeld and her team, who are based in California. I've been training directly with Lola over the past 6 months or so. Excuse me. So why might you be interested in EMC? Really, it offers a way to resolve work-based conflict and hopefully even resolve disconnections before they get to conflict, if this was in place. But very often my way into a company is often because there's a pain point, because there's conflict in a senior relationship and in a relationship that matters. And thus, increase productivity and the bottom line. Creating a psychologically safe environment. So this also impacts on well-being, on creating, a healthy place to work, and a great place to work. Increases team effectiveness and engagement, because really what you're doing is helping to take away the noise by giving people a language and a way to, work with each other's feelings. Then they can you're taking away all that extra noise that activates the amygdala, and then you can just focus on the work and get the work done. So this is also a way of addressing the anger, the stonewalling, the passive aggressive behavior, and the lack of trust that can happen in the workplace and is very unpleasant to experience. It helps to repair relationships and increases that emotional connection. And when you've got that emotional connection and you feel safe and secure, and again, you can work. So we all need to feel that it's safe to be our authentic self at work, because then we're more innovative, we're better problem solvers, we're more collaborative, our intelligence rises. Basically, you're in a good place, and you can do the work and you can work to your potential. So to build agile teams that can evolve and change due to their relational strength, so that they can deal with the stresses and strains that come with all the uncertainty, because they have the language and the skills to understand what's happening for themselves and for the others around them, and develop a more positive, healthy atmosphere, trusting atmosphere that supports coaching and collaboration and communication. So there's some of the benefits, really. So to learn more about EMC, if you're interested, that's Lola's book. Not too thick, not too heavy a read, Emotional Connection. She has another one that's available. If you go onto their website, it's emcleaders.com. There's a huge amount of resources on their website. Obviously, they're US based. They have case studies, they have testimonials, but they have all different resources as well. They have a lot of the statistics about conflict and the costs of conflict and so on. I'm the representative in Europe, really. There's at the moment nobody else doing this in Ireland, UK, or Europe. So if you are interested in bringing it to your workplace or learning a little bit more about it this part of the world, I would be the person to contact. If you're interested in training it yourself, get in touch with me, have a conversation. Lola likewise would be happy to have a conversation. Two of us jump on a call either. So yeah, I mean, just I suppose to explain in a very practical way, there's kind of two parts to how this might look. One is what we call the reconnection session, which is where we bring you through a very structured process when there's a disconnection to help you to reconnect. You can do that just yourself with me, for example. That would take about 90 minutes, and that helps you to come to a different place in how you feel and how you perceive the whole disconnection. Optimally, of course, I would work with you and the other person in the disconnection. That would take maybe about 2 hours. So for just as a special offer at the moment, I am offering either the one-to-one or the 1-to-2, and those reconnection sessions at a highly discounted price of just €100 per hour. So that is a big cut to what I would normally charge for my coaching hours. So yeah, €100 per hour and it might take about 90 minutes. That's usually what we'd allow for the one-to-one, and maybe 2 hours for two people together. But it's extremely beneficial and a very safe process. As you can see, even we use that one of those, that tool that you learned earlier, I'm going through that negative cycle there that you have to identify. So really bring you very safely through the whole process. And again, using that slow motion camera, slowing things down so that you can understand and see, and then moving into a positive cycle so that you're reconnecting and re-establishing safety and trust with each other. So that's my offer to you today. I'm going to just copy the Calendly link into the chat for you. If you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, just get in touch with me by email or send me a message if you're interested. So the Calendly link there is really just it's more like a 15-minute just quick call to see what it is that you're thinking about, whether you'd like one-to-one or do you like the two of you, or how you might go with that. Is it suitable for this? We'll set up an appointment then. So likewise, you can use that Calendly link to just have, if you haven't met me before and you'd like to have a discussion, you'd like to learn a little bit more about this, or if you have any questions coming out of it. And if you haven't connected me on LinkedIn, please do.